Thank you very much for having me on the show, Martin. Hallo Canadese Nederlanders and Dutch Touch listeners on CJMR. On August 14, 1957, there was a cave-in at a construction site in Dresden, Ontario. 6 Dutch immigrant workers were buried alive. It was Ontario's worst workplace tragedy, and it was big news at the time, but today this story has completely disappeared. And I'm glad I can share a little bit of it with you now. And perhaps some of you will want to help us bring this story to screen so that it will never be forgotten again. A few years ago, I asked my mother, who's Dutch by the way, what my English father did in Canada before he met her. And she told me a story I'd never heard before. She said that he had been the site engineer for a waterworks construction project in Dresden, that he'd been concerned about an excavation. He talked to the older and more experienced contractor about it, but nothing was done. Then there was a cave-in and 6 men were killed. Now, I was really struck by this, but when I looked for more information on the internet, I couldn't find anything, which was surprising. But in 2020, my mother made a big discovery, and she found his diary, photos, letters, drawings, and everything. And now we had a detailed, like a day-by-day description of everything that happened in Dresden. For example, on the first night he arrived, before he'd even started working, he wrote in his diary, "The bank is steep. We'll probably have to do soil testing." So he could see the risk already before the job has started. And I really felt we have to do something with this material. And last year I took the plunge and started working on a documentary film about it. On August 1st, 1957, my dad wrote in his diary that a panel truck arrived with 5 workers of Dutch origin. From the newspapers at the time, I found the names of those men, and that's where I started. Since that time, I've met family members of all the men. I've spent countless hours searching archives, doing phone interviews, filming interviews on camera. And remember, this story is lost. There isn't one place or one person who can tell me the whole thing. So we're reconstructing it piece by piece, like assembling a big puzzle. And I say we because almost everyone we meet seems to join in the effort of saving this story. And it is like magic each time we find a new piece of the puzzle. I'll give you a few examples. By the middle of last August, I still didn't even know anything about the foreman, Dirk Reichsen, who had also died. I knew he had a wife and a young son. I knew they were the only family who'd moved back to Holland after the tragedy, but I didn't even know their names. 4 weeks later, I kid you not, I'm in Wageningen in the Netherlands interviewing John Reichsen on camera. Another example, I had no idea that there was television footage of the cave-in, but the same John Reichsen told me that he'd seen something online. So searching in the Ontario archives, I found that CFPL London had in fact sent a television crew to Dresden. So there's film of the event. And amongst those shots, I saw my father as a 25-year-old man. There are still some important records I'd love to find, like the police report or records from the trial. But we can reconstruct some of that from newspaper reports, of which there are hundreds. In fact, the story was even covered in Holland by at least 7 different newspapers. But the story is not just about an accident that shouldn't have happened or a tragedy that shouldn't have been forgotten. This is the story of Dutch immigration to Canada, and it's a story that's also not well known enough. In those early years, 1947 until the mid-50s, almost every Dutch immigrant had to work for a Canadian farmer for their first year in Canada. And certainly some of those farmer sponsors were good, but others were not so great. Sometimes a farmer would decide he didn't even want them, even after they'd arrived in Canada. So they're there with their family, their household, and they've got no job. Families were forced to live often in terrible conditions, unsanitary homes with no running water or toilets. And families were sent to live in chicken coops, and I am not joking. Sometimes farmers were even physically abusive. The Drent family, for example, spent weeks secretly emptying their household at night, taking all their possessions because they had to escape this farmer who was so dangerous. Also, financially, it was difficult. Often the whole family had to work, for example, harvesting tobacco just to make ends meet. So for many men, finding work in construction was often a step up and possibly the only way to save money to eventually buy their own farm. That's what happened to the men in this story who found work with Keeler Construction. Some of them had been there for a year and some more recently, but all of them were part of a large Dutch crew building the Highway 73 overpass over the 401 between London and Aylmer. When that job was finished, the foreman and these five men went to Dresden. That's when they make their appearance in my father's diary and in some of his photos. 2 weeks after starting in Dresden, they were pouring the concrete foundations for the pumping station beside the river. On the riverside, the pit was about 15 feet deep, but on the opposite bank, because it rose so steeply, the wall of the pit was about 35 feet deep. At 7 p.m., they were almost finished pouring the last load of concrete when the east wall of the pit collapsed, burying the five men. The foreman, who was standing at the edge of the pit, was dragged in and also killed. There's so much more to tell, how the townspeople tried desperately to save the men. In the end, it took 38 hours to recover all of the bodies. The terribly sad moments when each family got the news about the mass funeral in Aylmer, the police investigation, the inquest, and the trial. But I'll summarize and say that the deaths were ruled accidental. Incredible. The contractor was acquitted, and there were no meaningful consequences, and the story was very quickly forgotten. When I say forgotten, I mean forgotten. I've yet to meet an expert in Ontario history or in Dutch immigration or workplace safety who's even heard of the Dresden tragedy. And of course, that's why we're making this film. Now, right now, we're running a crowdfunding campaign to raise money that will allow us to finish filming. Every dollar helps. But we're also looking for people who can make larger contributions like $5,000, $10,000, or even more. We've had a few of those, but a few more would really make a difference. If you're interested, please visit Dresden1957.com. So that's one word, DRESDEN 1957.com, and click on Help Us Make This Film. Everyone who joins the campaign will be able to follow the project through to completion. This is why we're raising money, because we really hope to finish this film, complete it for 2025. Thank you very much, Martin, for having me, and Dutch Touch listeners, thank you. Hartelijk bedankt allemaal.